The first topic you're going to review this week is education research. And I'm going to give you a basic overview of education research. So just some terms that you need to know when you're looking at education research. You need to know sample, population, and subjects. Sample is usually denoted by a capital N, and that is how many people or students were studied in a piece of research. The population describes what type of students or teachers or school districts you look at. Were they second language learners? Were they special education students? Were they teachers of color? You're very specific about who you studied. And then lastly, your subjects, who your students were, what their ages were, their grades, their achievement levels, all the information that someone would need to understand your research project. So there are two basic types of research. There's quantitative research and qualitative research, and they're very different. Quantitative research has to do with hard numbers, and you're collecting frequency data, you're collecting the mean and the median and the mode with this data. You're looking for how things changed over time using numbers. Qualitative research is when we as researchers use interviews and focus groups and talking to people and observing people and writing things down in narrative form. And then we go back and we code the data and we look for themes and things that came out through the conversations that we have with people or observations that we had. So in educational research, you first select a problem and you design a research procedure and collect data on that problem. You analyze your data and then you make a statement of conclusions based on the results of your data analysis at the end. So there are several difficulties that arise in educational research. The first is that it involves human beings, which don't always act the way we expect them to. In terms of generalization, a lot of times there are problems if you study something in a classroom or a school or even a district, it can't always generalize to other schools or classrooms or districts. You have to study lots of different schools before you can say this happens everywhere. Or a lot of different schools in different states even to be able to generalize information. Also, controls are hard to contain in school settings because you can't keep treatment from a student, meaning if you have two students that are getting a great new reading program and one is the control group and one is not, meaning that the control group doesn't get the new great reading program, and there's an ethical issue involved in that we'll talk about on the next slide. The other issue is settings. Classrooms aren't always the best places to conduct research for lots of different reasons. They can be busy places, and sometimes it's hard to collect information that we need when we're researching. And then lastly is the variables. There are lots of different things to consider when you're working with children or adults in terms of, did the student act that way because they really couldn't read the passage, or did they act that way because they just had a fight with their friend at recess? So there's lots of different variables that can come into play that we can't necessarily control for. So in terms of ethics, we always need to get informed consent from people that we are studying. Children, by legal definition, cannot give consent because they're under the age of 18, so you would have to get consent from a parent before you did any sort of research project in your classroom. Also, we want to make sure that we're maintaining confidentiality with student name, student information. Even at times we can provide anonymity to them when we're doing studies. And we always want to make sure that we're avoiding harming students or people that we're studying in any way. Also, in a classroom situation with children, deception is always unacceptable. You don't ever want to deceive anyone during the course of data collection. And then we always want to accurately record data. We want to make sure that if we are studying our own classroom or our own projects, that we're accurately recording the information so that the data we're not coding the data so that it shows something that we want it to show. So in terms of strong educational research, there are some things you need to look out for when you're reading through, say, for example, a research paper. You want to make sure that there's a large sample size, meaning they studied a lot of children or a lot of people, and or several smaller samples. And this came up, I believe, the first time we looked at the What Works Clearinghouse. Somebody asked why small samples were included as an evidence base. And this is one of those reasons. If there are several small samples that all show the same thing, that makes it a strong study. You need to make sure that in a research paper the population is clearly defined. The sampling is clearly described, meaning who they did the study on. You want to make sure that research is free of bias, that the researcher isn't leaning a certain way because of their own beliefs. And you want to make sure that the research is valid and reliable. And we'll talk about those in a couple slides. So what we mostly see in the classroom, and if you ever complete like a master's project or thesis, usually those are based in action research. That's very common in the classroom setting. And this is something also that intuitive teachers do very naturally when they have a problem that they need to solve in their own classroom. So when you're looking at a problem in your classroom, a lot of times it started with a prompt of a question like this one. I wonder if I tried blank, the students would be more blank. For example, I wonder if I tried transition music, if the students would be more quiet when transitioning from subject to subject. So there are 5 steps to the action research project. Number 1, identify the issue, review the literature, develop a strategy, collect and analyze your data, and take action and share results. And sometimes this can happen within one day, sometimes this can happen within a week, sometimes it can happen very quickly on the fly when you need to do it, need to implement something for students. So step 1, identify the issue. You need to pick something that's important in your classroom, and you need to pick something that's going to impact student learning. It can be about your teaching habits, and you want to make sure that the parents are involved and know what you're doing if it's a larger scale study. Number 2, you want to learn about the issue. You want to look at those peer-reviewed vetted sources like on the ERIC website or the DataQuest or the EBSCO website. And you want to look at single subject studies, meaning like if a teacher did a study in their own classroom. You want to look at what methods were used, and you want to look at the strengths of the study and what the limitations were, which is generally at the end of a research report. And then you want to refine your question based on what you learned in those articles. So step 3, you want to develop a strategy. So what do you want to do, or what do you want the students to do? And how will you measure that they've done it? You need to take a baseline, which is where the students are starting, and then you want to take post-intervention data. So you want to see where they're at, implement your strategy, and then take some data at the end. How often you need to decide, how often you want to measure data, and how you'll measure that it worked. So step 4 is data gathering and analysis. We need to make sure that we're looking for observable behaviors in our students. Are they more quiet? Are they in their seats? Are they able to complete a task better? We need all those ethical considerations. We need to make sure we're not doing students harm, that we're not deceiving them, that we're not keeping things from one group of students but giving them to another. And then also, as I mentioned, the baseline data, and then also a timeline. How long are you going to take with this? Is this just a day that you're going to figure out if this strategy worked or not? Are you going to give it a week, 2 weeks? Are you going to have a controlled group? For example, if you teach in a middle school and you're having classroom management problems with 2 of your periods, maybe in one period you'll just stay the course, whatever your classroom management strategy previously was, and then in another period you're going to try to implement a new classroom management system, and then you can compare the two and see how different they are. And then you need to make sure that what you're using, the strategy you're using, is valid and that it's reliable. So the first thing, when it's valid, when you are looking at you want to make sure that when you are collecting data that you're actually measuring what you want to measure, okay? And then reliable is if you do it over and over again, will you get the same results? And then lastly, step 5 is take action and share. So you want to return to your initial question and see if the strategy you implemented helped in your classroom. And then you can decide if the results can help others at your school, and you might want to share it with people at your school site. The ethical consideration to this is you wouldn't, let's say you implemented a new strategy that you came up with on your own. It would not be ethical if it worked really well in your classroom to then package it and sell it to other people. That's not ethical because of that generalization issue that it might not work for others. And then you can also think about what would you do differently next time, and then also what your next topic for your action research will be. So the next group that we're going to look at is evidence-based practices, and that flows from what strong research is and how we can figure out evidence-based practices to use with our students.